Hi there, I'm Andreas Marazis and I'm the host of the ENC In-Depth Podcast. Today's in-depth discussion is dedicated on the EU accession process in the Western Balkans and the Roma. The debate is part of the ENC In-Depth Podcast discussions with experts and academics assessing the developments in Western Balkans in the fields of security, foreign policy, economy, democracy, and education. Today, we have with us a distinguished speaker from academia, Dr. Yorgos Christidis, who is an associate professor of comparative politics in the Balkans at the Department of Balkan, Slavonic and Oriental Studies of the University of Macedonia, Thessaloniki. He's also a research fellow at ELIAMEP and ENC Academic Council member. Yorgo, welcome to the ENC In-Depth Podcast. Thank you for being virtually present with me today.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion.
So, Yorgo, you recently published an article in which you examine the position of the Roma in the Western Balkan countries and the effectiveness of EU's Roma policy, if I may call it like this, among other things. I would like to start our discussion by asking you first to give us a brief introduction of how is the current situation in the Balkans with regards to Roma, which are the main challenges in the region, actually. Thank you.
Okay, I think we should first start with a brief mention on the position of the Roma in the various Balkan countries. Roma communities exist everywhere in the Balkans, and with the term Balkans, we include not only the Western Balkans, but also countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece. One thing that one notices straight away is that there is a discrepancy between official estimates and unofficial estimates on the number of the Roma living in the various countries. I can give you various examples. In Albania, the official census of 2011 mentioned around 11,000 Roma, whereas unofficial estimates by NGOs and the Council of Europe mention 10 times the number of that, around 115,000. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, the 2013 census mentions around 12,000 Roma, whereas unofficial estimates talk about between 40 and 70,000 Roma. In Montenegro, we have a similar situation. We have 6,000 around Roma and another group which actually is classified as being different, but is regarded as part of the wider Roma community, the so-called Egyptians, around 2,000, whereas unofficial estimates of those two groups put the number between 13 and 21,000 people. North Macedonia, we have a similar situation. The 2002 census talks about around 53,000 Roma, whereas unofficial estimates talk about between 80 and 130,000 Roma. Serbia has the largest Roma community in the Western Balkans. The 2011 census mentions around 147,000 Roma, whereas unofficial estimates talk about between 250 and 500,000 Roma. The situation is similar to Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece. Bulgaria officially has 320,000 Roma, and unofficially possibly as many as 750,000. And this is an estimate by the European Commission. Romania has officially 620,000 Roma, whereas unofficially most estimates talk between 1 and 2 million Roma. In Greece, which is not mentioned quite often, has unofficially, because officially there's no number on the Roma in Greece, but unofficial estimates talk about around 250,000 Roma. Then coming from a city like Thessaloniki, which has seen in the last 2 decades a noticeable growth in the number of Roma because of the migration from Bulgaria and Romania, this is obvious that the number of Roma has grown considerably in Greece during the last 2 decades with the opening of the borders with the Balkan heartland. So we have that discrepancy that has a variety of reasons why it's happening. Certainly, there is a tendency among the Roma themselves not to declare in the official census as their ethnicity Roma. They tend, a number of them, to identify with other ethnic groups. For example, the case of Bulgaria, they tend to identify with ethnic Bulgarianness or even with ethnic Turkishness. So among the Roma themselves, what we see is that not everyone declares itself as a Roma, and this also has to do with the stage of the development of what we can say is a Roma identity consciousness. It's not fully developed. One of the issues that anthropologists have underlined studying the Roma communities in Eastern Europe is exactly this lack of a well-formed Roma identity throughout Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And this can be seen not only on issues of self-declaration, it can be seen also on the political representation of the Roma. It's very striking, for example, that although we are talking about numerous communities, nevertheless, in political terms, they're very weak because they haven't managed to act as a unified community that can put forward a political representation that can effectively fight for the rights of the Roma community. And this is, again, a result of this lack of a Roma consciousness among the Roma themselves. But I better stop here. Now, concerning the problems the Roma face all over the Balkans, we can talk about large-scale poverty and social exclusion as a main feature of the Roma communities. Now, on every major area, from unemployment and housing to education, healthcare, there are statistics that are quite grim. Now, on unemployment, for example, the Roma have the highest unemployment, and especially long-term unemployment everywhere in the region. Housing conditions are terrible. Since 1989-1990, an increasingly large number of Roma live in illegally constructed houses. And this creates a number of problems. They don't have access to public services, for example, because their houses are illegally built, quite simply. They're outside the municipal borders quite often. There are no roads leading to the areas where they live, and they live in conditions of segregation. In other words, we are talking about a modern phenomenon of ghettoization among the Roma communities in many countries, certainly of Southeastern Europe. It's very interesting. 200 years following the end of the last Jewish ghettos in Europe, the last one was in Rome, right? The middle of the 19th century. We have the appearance of de facto ghettos in many cities in Southeastern Europe. To continue, in education, since 1989, 1990, we have a deterioration of the anyway low educational attainment among the Roma communities. Now, in addition, one could certainly mention a number of other socioeconomic problems the Roma face, like growing isolation of the segregated neighborhoods, exclusion from the labor market, limited access to healthcare, social assistance, and of course, limited opportunities for contacts with members of the other communities. Now, concerning the ex-communist countries, one observation that can be made is that the Roma appear to be among the major losers of the so-called transition that took place with the changes of 1989-90. The position of the Roma wasn't ideal before 1989-1990. Certainly, they faced problems of marginalization, but after 1989-1990, we have a very serious deterioration of the Roma everywhere in Eastern Europe, as the Roma, in effect, find it very difficult to deal with market economy and also with the new, if I can say, the new dominant ethos and ideology, which actually demanded a withdrawn role of the state from society. Because what happened after 1989-1990, the reforms that took place throughout Eastern Europe were reforms that were, let's say, advised by the World Bank. It's the so-called Washington Consensus, based upon all ex-Eastern European states were called upon to make a number of reforms, privatizations, monetary stability, etc., etc. Now, those reforms were based on the logic that the state had really to change fundamentally its role from an all-pervasive state in society and the economy. The state was called to limit its presence in society. And that also made sense in the new, if you like, financial realities that many states faced with recession. So in other words, at a time when the Roma as a community were in need of state assistance in order to cope with the changes, the state was withdrawing itself, was, if you like, was re-examining its role in society and the economy. So, and the Roma paid, if I can use that term, the price for that realignment of state policies. So the effect was that by the end of the 90s, we have a clear situation in all over Southeastern Europe where the position of the Roma is much worse than 10 years earlier.
Thank you very much, George, for this brief introduction of the current situation with regards to Roma in Balkan area. Now, I wanted you, since you mentioned about the formulation of policies and realignment and so on, I want you to guide us through the formulation and evolution of the EU's policy towards Roma, focusing on the most significant milestones, if I may.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Now, prior to 1989, the European communities back then and the Council of Europe did not have a Roma-related policy. Well, but with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the communist regimes, we had a major change on policy making. Specifically, the prospect of the reunification of the European continent opened the possibility and created the fear of a massive migration of impoverished Roma from ex-Eastern Europe to Western Europe. That, in effect, put the issue of the Roma on the agenda of organizations like the Council of Europe and the European Union. Now, the Council of Europe was the first pan-European institution to adopt in 1993 a document treating the Roma as, quote, a European minority in need of special attention, unquote. Now, the EU eastward enlargement of 2003 and 2007 created, of course, another major incentive for the development of EU-centered policy on the Roma, as the expectation was that the number of the Roma living in inside the Union would surpass the 11 million, making them the largest minority group inside the Union. Now, since 2003, we have basically two policy initiatives that stand out. The first one is, of course, the Decade of Roma Inclusion of 2005, which is an idea by the Open Society Foundation that was supported by the European Union. And the second is the so-called framework for national Roma integration strategies that was adopted by the European Commission in 2011. Now, EU policies since the mid-2000s have been promoting Roma integration and inclusion, targeting 4 priority areas, that is employment, housing, education, and healthcare. And with that also, we should add gender issues and the fight against discrimination and what has been called anti-Gypsyism. Now, in order to support national efforts towards Roma inclusion and its own policy ambitions, the European Union has used, since the 90s, various funding mechanisms. We should mention some. The FAR program, for example, in the 1990s, provided job training to Roma and awareness campaigns to educate Roma about their rights. And of course, more recently, there is funding provided through the European Structural Investment Funds and principally the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund. Now, the distribution of funding and the management of the programs are the responsibility of national authorities. Funding comes in 2 forms: the shared management, jointly by the European and the member states, and direct management by the European Commission.
Can I add one follow-up short question on what you mentioned about the distribution of funds and the kind of trainings and programs on access to employment, healthcare, etc. Out of since I'm part of a civil society organization, think tank organizations, how easy is for Roma communities, wherever they are based, to access this kind of information that is concerning employment trainings, educational trainings, vocational education training, and so on? And how willing are the local authorities to support these communities based on what you said, like of ghettoization, like marginalization, and so on of these communities? Let's be frank, like what's the level of access to information for these people to be aware of these projects and to participate in these projects?
This is
from your own experience, from what you know.
Yes, the question touches upon many issues at the same time. First of all, it touches upon, let's say, the Roma community itself. Given the general level of illiteracy now characterizing many Roma communities, talk about knowledge of EU programs is a joke, dealing with that. Secondly, there are certainly many NGOs that have been very active throughout Southeastern Europe, involved in programs that target Roma communities, that take advantage of the available funding. But the question is, if and to what extent that makes a difference. Now, thirdly, on the role of municipal authorities. Certainly the role of the municipal authorities is crucial, as in so many other issues. But here we come upon a very delicate issue of public perceptions. Public perceptions regarding the Roma that certainly affect and condition political responses, even at the level of the municipal authorities. Now, public perceptions concerning the Roma are far from friendly. There is a stereotypical view of the Roma everywhere in Southeastern Europe that sees them as a parasitical community that takes advantage of the various social assistance programs that are being provided. And the feeling is that the Roma should never be supported, are not worthy of any kind of support. And the emphasis, if I can put it, if you like, simplistically, should be on law and order. Now, public perceptions are very crucial in the whole debate. What do we do with the Roma predicament? And the public perceptions, as long as there are so much hostile towards the Roma, will not facilitate any kind of decisions by political parties in the direction of intervening more effectively in alleviating the social issues faced by Roma. This is an important missing link in the whole, if you like, debate about how to deal effectively with the impoverishment and marginalization of the Roma. To put it differently, public opinion seems like in most of the countries of Southeastern Europe is totally indifferent. The problems faced by the Roma. They are seen mainly in terms of a social burden. They're seen mainly in terms of culturally different. And that poses many problems for policy making, etc.
Well, I don't want to drag this further, but I guess trainings, educational trainings, information should not only include Roma communities, but also the actual communities that are, if I may use the term, hosting these Roma communities. So basically, the negative perception that exists, maybe it's something that the national government should look into. Maybe, and I'm not knowledgeable about the political situation in each country in the Balkans, but maybe there are political risks included in like informing the population about this or not. I'm not sure, but definitely in order to have, if the society is interested in being like inclusive, if the states are interested in having a multicultural kind of approach in their society, then these people, whether they like it or not, they are there. And we're talking about like considerable numbers, which are excluded from what we discussed already from several social services, basically services. So I think that maybe we can start on alleviating or the wall, if I may call it like that, exists between locals and Roma, and try to make them understand each other or bring them closer. Or maybe this sounds too idealistic, I don't know. But this is like my own thoughts. If you want to comment, feel free.
Yes, if I can say something, Andrea. Certainly an issue of values in society, as you put it rightly. Do you accept cultural differences, linguistic differences, religious differences? Because in many cases, the Roma, for example, among themselves, use different languages. Quite often they have more than one religious association. But beyond that, there are other issues that really challenge, if you like, the present dominant approach towards the Roma. I could mention some. Take, for example, the demographic situation of a country like Bulgaria. Bulgaria faces, according to demographers, a catastrophic demographic scenario. Since the beginning of the 90s, has lost around 2 million of its population. Now, the only community inside Bulgaria that is demographically dynamic is the one that is also marginalized, the Roma. Now, by 2050, the latest projections by demographers, is that Bulgaria would have lost around 40% of its population compared to 1989. But that doesn't, however, concern the Roma. Now, a question that arises is, what will politically happen in a context where Bulgaria will be around 6 million, but will have possibly more than 20% of its population in conditions of third world marginalization, enclaves of unimaginable poverty? What will that politically mean? Can really Bulgaria afford to continue like that, ignoring the realities, the dynamics, the demographic dynamics? Now, this situation also generates security risks. In the past, again, if I can mention Bulgaria, we had some interesting cases of how marginalized Roma communities in a city called Pazarcik became radicalized by Islamic radicals. Now, in that case, the security authorities acted fastly and really isolated specific danger. But what will happen if you have more cases like this? What does it mean to have a community that is living in marginalized conditions and where you have narratives of victimization coming from abroad? What does that mean? Can Bulgaria afford to continue down that road? So there are, I think, clearly a number of reasons that really dictate a much more serious debate on the predicament faced by the Roma and on the policies that can actually promote change. Because right now, as most NGOs, research centers that deal with the Roma claim, is that the change is marginal by the policies that are implemented by national governments with the support of the European Union. And there is an obvious question that arises.
Well, thanks a lot for your thoughts and comments on that. And really, indeed, these are important questions that need to be answered, and the debate goes on that. Now, let me get back to the EU's strategy or policy towards the Roma. And we all know that there are no strategies or policies without flaws. Now, I want to be a little bit provocative, and I wanted to ask you, which are the main shortcomings or, let's say, loopholes in EU's approach towards Roma people in general, and especially when it comes to the Balkans, including, of course, the Western Balkans?
Okay, as we said, there is a question mark regarding the effectiveness of the approach used by the European Union. That, of course, does not deny the significance of the EU approach during the last 2 decades, because if it wasn't and that, then things would have been much worse. The prospect of accessing the European Union has really acted as a positive force upon states of ex-Eastern Europe, Central Europe and Southeastern Europe in taking a number of measures in the direction of alleviating poverty and marginalization. But still, those measures implemented haven't changed the overall situation. Now, one of the issues that has been repeatedly pointed out is that even those programs that have been adopted and the measures that have been adopted, measures announced by the European Union, haven't been properly implemented. And that concerned also concerns states who have entered the European Union, but also states like those of the Western Balkans that are in a process of joining the European Union. There is lack of proper implementation that has to do with the lack of human resources, but also financial resources on the part of the national government. So there is a question of the proper implementation of, let's say, EU funds. There's also a question about the implementation of anti-discrimination legislation that has been adopted, most of the cases, everywhere in the region. In many cases, simply is not being implemented. But I think beyond that, the situation, for example, in Bulgaria, calls upon much more drastic intervention in the direction of eradicating the poverty and ghettoization of a specific community. I think that necessitates, of course, a much more generous and dynamic intervention on the part of national governments and also on the part of the European Union. If I can say something in that direction, we all know that there has been a social summit by the European Union. It was in Gothenburg last time, where EU leaders agreed to a European pillar of social rights. Now, the European Commission has unveiled an action plan to turn the so-called pillar into reality. It includes three main targets on employment, training, and fewer people at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Maybe the European Commission should consider to be much more specific regarding the Roma as part of the aim of eradicating poverty as part of, let's say, of the European pillar of social rights.
All right. Now, it seems to me that you are quite an expert when it comes to Bulgaria, and you quite well informed. In your article, you mentioned about integration process of Roma, and you are also talking a little bit about the case of Bulgaria. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? How we can move on with the integration process and a little bit the case of Bulgaria and the Roma community there?
Okay. Now, as we said, Bulgaria has a considerable Roma community. Officially around 320,000 people, and officially possibly more than 700,000 people. Now, by the end of the 1990s, it had become clear that Roma standards of living had sharply deteriorated. Now, until the end of the 90s, Bulgaria had failed, in effect, to develop any kind of policy for dealing with the deteriorating position of the Roma in the country. And that has an explanation why. The 90s in general were a turbulent period in Bulgarian politics, in society, and economics. And the Roma do not figure as a part of, of the issues that Bulgarian society actually debates at all. Now, the opening of accession negotiations with the European Union, the year 2000, provided a stimulus on Bulgarian governments to develop policies dealing with Roma marginalization. I can mention some examples. A Protection from Discrimination Act adopted by the Bulgarian Parliament in September 2003, the Action Plan for the Implementation of the Framework Program for Roma Integration, adopted in October 2003. And June 2005, we have another important plan, the Action Plan for Achieving the Goals of the Decade of Roma Inclusion. That was adopted in the context of the Decade of Roma Inclusion. Now, one thing that one notices, for example, is the lack of of proper finance of those programs. For example, the last one, the action plan for achieving the goals of the decade, had a budget for a period of 10 years of 37 million euros, which, you know, if you take into account the very ambitious aims it was setting, as a sum, it was totally, how can I put it? It was very small. Okay. Now, Bulgarian government continued to adopt plans in various areas. And of course, with the adoption of the EU framework for national Roma integration strategies up to 2020, Bulgaria adopted its own national integration strategy. Now, what do we see after all those programs that were adopted and implemented? By the end of the 2010, of the decade of 2010, most monitoring reports of the Bulgarian national Roma integration strategy were underlining that in most areas, real progress concerning Roma inclusion was missing. So Bulgaria has adopted 3 major plans for dealing with Roma marginalization, has used EU funds during the last 2 decades. And what do we see at the end of the day? That they prove inadequate to deal with the present problems that the Roma face. Now, there is an obvious question here. Are we going to continue like that? Are we going to drastically change the way we see the problem?
Now, since you're posing this question, if you could really pinpoint, based on your opinion, in your experience, what should be the next logical steps, either at the national, local level and at the EU level, in order to address these issues that Roma communities face and to, let's say, promote their integration at some point?
I think it has to begin at the national level. Let's be clear. I think societies must begin a much more serious debate on what to do with Roma marginalization. Because it seems right now they have sidelined the issue. Mm-hmm. It's like we prefer to remain where it is as long as it does not touch us, which is not actually true, because the issues that Roma marginalization generate, like criminality, that touch us all. So a society cannot afford really to close its eyes on an issue of such magnitude, because this is the really interesting question. The problems faced by the Roma are not small, are very big. Nevertheless, there is a consensus. There is a dominant consensus that says, leave it. You have to use law and order. That's it. Full stop. But that approach simply does not address the issue. Now, there have been some anthropologists that draw some parallels with the position of the Afro-Americans, that, the state, the political elite in the United States in the 60s realized that it could not continue the policies of, tolerating segregation, ghettoization of the Afro-American community. It intervened massively with positive discrimination programs, with the civil rights movement, etc., etc. In addressing exactly those, social imbalances. And the United States still struggles to deal with the effects of policies that have been tolerated from the 19th century until, the middle of the 20th century. So it's very dangerous if you leave a problem to acquire such dimensions, then it's very difficult to deal with it. Time does not work on your side. So, in other words, societies themselves must debate what to do. How, in a long-term prospect, because only in a long-term prospect they can really address and change things. So you can really ignore that issue, and it's not, enough to have few NGOs, few academics, some politicians who deal from time to time with the Roma, go on radio, TV. I think the issue is much more serious. I feel that we simply underestimate the dimensions of the problem.
I agree with you, and I think that the first thing is that, based from what you already mentioned in today's discussion, is that we have to change the mindset of the population, the local level, the perceptions, and this indifference towards this quite significant group, which is a significant part of the population in several countries, especially in the Balkans. At this point, I would like to thank you and conclude actually our today's in-depth podcast discussion. Yorgo, it was an excellent opportunity to virtually catch up with you and to have your very interesting insights and thoughts on this topic. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you for the invitation.
I'm Andreas Marazis, and that was the ENC In-Depth Podcast.